Okay, so the last phase of this first part of the course is moving in this direction. We're going to learn how to take passages from ordinary language or natural language, translate them into standard form, categorical syllogisms, and then abbreviate that even more and turn it into symbolic form, where everything becomes a major premise, a minor premise, a conclusion, and three terms, namely a subject term, predicate term, and a middle term. The conclusion will always be an A, an E, an I, or an O proposition, and will contain the subject and predicate term. The major premise will contain the major term, which is the predicate term of the conclusion. Whatever other proposition contains that, that will be your major premise, and that's called the major premise, and that goes first always. And it will be an A, an E, an I, or an O proposition. And then whatever other proposition contains the minor premise of the conclusion, that will be, or the minor term of your conclusion, the subject term of your conclusion is your minor term, that will be your minor premise. Whatever other proposition contains the minor, the subject term of your conclusion, that's called your minor premise. So we have to put that in the right form. Then you can, in the right order. The middle term will be either in one time, it will be in the major premise, and then it'll appear again in the minor premise. But it'll never appear in the conclusion. The middle term is what mediates the inference. And the predicate term will always be in the major premise, and the subject term will always be in the minor premise. So we go from ordinary language, that's chapter 7. That'll be the topic of discussion for next time. I'd like you to go ahead and work on that if you're up to that point. Work on chapter 7. But chapter 6 is the key one. With chapter 6, you don't need to deal with the appendix of chapter 6, where Copy and his co-writers provide a deduction to the 15 valid syllogisms. That's beyond the scope of this course. In fact, that would be called meta-logic, where you're actually creating a deduction of the logical system. That's a whole different ballgame. That's called meta-logic. Meta means beyond. So you don't have to worry about that. But I would read over 6.5, which is an exposition of the 15 valid syllogisms. But the key ones are 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, and 6.4. And you have to work on that. And I feel a little responsible because of this forum, the distance way of doing that. If this were a face-to-face course, we'd be working many problems in class, like going to the board and so on. So I have to leave that up to you to work examples. That's really important, to work examples. I've been stressing that all along. So I told you, so that's the whole thing. You go from ordinary language, that's chapter 7, you learn some methods of doing that, put it into standard form, categorical syllogisms, and then bracket, by bracket I mean change the content into form and turn the subject, predicate, and middle terms into just SP and M. So then it becomes symbolic form. And then you can make your 3 circles and you can test the validity using the Venn diagram technique. And that takes practice because sometimes it goes on the line. And there's, in this new edition, the 15th edition, I see on page 201, and throughout the book, I see what they've done to add to this is they add a little section called visual logic, because they know people sometimes learn visually when they can see things. And on page 201, there's a good example of the visual logic of the Venn diagrams and to show when the X goes on the line. Okay. When it goes on the line, I call that intolerable ambiguity. So it could be on one side, it could be on the other side. And the whole process, and let me just say this once again, but I know I've been really stressing this, but it sometimes helps to repeat yourself the important things. The whole process of testing the validity of syllogisms using the Venn diagram technique is that you diagram the major and minor premise, and then you stop diagramming. That's it. Then you look to the conclusion. The rest is all just done in your mind. You're making a judgment. Just like we said about critical thinking is making a judgment or evaluating an argument. In this case, we're judging whether or not it's valid or not, or whether or not the reasoning process is correct. It has nothing to do with truth, right? Truth has to do with whether or not the propositions correspond to reality. We're looking at the reasoning process. So when you diagram the major and minor premise, if the conclusion is already diagrammed, then it's valid. And I want you to be able to figure out what that means. I had a little epiphany when I was first studying logic. What that means is the conclusion is already contained in the premises. Otherwise, after having diagrammed the premises, it wouldn't appear. If it appears already, if you diagram only the premises and the conclusion appears, that means the conclusion was already in the premises. You're just drawing it out. And that's the very word deduction. So that's where I had my epiphany when I was your age and I was studying logic. I thought, well, that's so incredible that you're drawing a new truth from an already established truth. You're drawing it forth. Deducere, deduction. Okay, so there are only 3 ways of testing the validity of syllogisms once you have them in the standard abbreviated form. And one is the Venn diagram technique. That's the best one because you can see everything. But there's another technique that it's also quite edifying, and it's called the rules method. That's why I want to go over it with you very shortly, because Copy does a very good example. If you work on 6.4 and do the exercises, then you'll be in good shape. But perhaps I could simplify it. I just want to go over with you quickly. And then next time I'll do a talk on the chapter 7 on translating from ordinary language into standard form. So that's the second method. It's called the rules method. And I want you to know both. There's a third method, and I mentioned that before. It's called the coined named method. It was invented by these monks I told you in the Middle Ages. They came up with these 15 names. So you know there are 4 figures. So they made 4 names for figure 1, 4 names for figure 2, 4 names for figure 3, and 3 names for figure 4. If you could memorize those names, now I'm not going to ask you to memorize them for this course because everything in this course is open book, open notes, and all the 15 names are there. But I'm just urging you to memorize them if you can. And when you're young, it's easier to memorize things. Your mind is like a sponge. Just do 4 at a time. Take the first 4 and memorize them, and remember that they all go with figure 1, like Barbara and Fairy, Dari, Ferio, and so on. Memorize those names. Then you can use those as mnemonic devices, and it will help when you're inventing syllogisms. But I'm not going to demand that. It's just helpful. I've realized over time that the more you can put into your memory and the more you have immediate recognition, then that frees your mind to be more creative. That's the value of memorization sometimes. If you could memorize something, then it's there, and you don't have to be, because your mind can only do so many things at once. If one part is already intact, then you can use the other part to be creative. But if you have to be searching around for things, then it stifles the other part, the creative part of your mind. So see if you can memorize those 15 names. Just do 4 at a time. But I won't ask you to, well, since I am talking about what I am going to ask you, what I'm not going to ask you, I can tell you what I am going to ask you. This is the key. This is the main, I don't want to intimidate you, but this is the most, of the 2 quizzes were not hard compared to this. This is going to be a little harder. What I'm going to ask you to do for the first bigger exam, I'm going to give you a passage from ordinary language, more than one, maybe 5. Each one will be worth 20 points. And then I'm going to ask you to translate it into a standard form categorical syllogism. And then take another step towards form and bracket all the content, just put it in abbreviated symbolic form, like all S is P, no S is P, and so on. So you have your syllogism. Then I want you to name the mood and the figure of that syllogism. Then I'm going to ask you to test the syllogism with all three methods. Now, it sounds more complicated than it is. If you do the Venn diagram technique and it's valid, then you don't have to worry about the rules because it's not going to break any rules. And all you have to do is go through those 15 valid syllogisms and find out which one it matches. If it's an AAA or EA01 or whatever it is, and just say, this is Barbara, it's an AAA1, for example. And so it's valid. Okay. If it's invalid, if you do the Venn diagram technique and you find that it's invalid, then you have to determine which rule or rules it breaks and name that fallacy. Now, these are formal fallacies. Before we were studying informal fallacies. The informal fallacies are embedded in ordinary language. These are fallacies that are made in formal standard form categorical syllogisms. So you just have to name the rule that it breaks. If it's invalid by the Venn diagram technique, it's going to break a rule. And you just name the rule that it breaks and name the fallacy of what that, when you break that rule, there are names for that fallacy. We'll go over those. It's on page, well, there's a summary of it on page 209, but he explains all the fallacies in a long-winded kind of way. But you always want to look to the overview in the book because it's a summary of everything. But don't skip over the reading because otherwise you won't know. Summaries are good after you've read the longer exposition, then you have the summary that pulls it all together. So that'll be your exam. I'll make 5 arguments in ordinary language. You'll translate those into standard form categorical syllogisms. Each one will be worth 20%. And then I'm going to ask you to put it into standard form first, then symbolic form or abbreviated form, like all S is P, no S is P, some S is not P, and you're bracketing content. Then I want you to name the mood and figure, and then test it by all 3 means. So you do the Venn diagram first. If it's valid, your work is almost done. You just have to find what name it corresponds to. If it's invalid, then it's not going to be any name because there's only 15 names, and those are names that correspond to the vowels of the names correspond to the mood of the and figure of the syllogism. And if it's invalid, I want you to show that on your Venn diagram, and then name the rule that it breaks and the fallacy of that rule that it breaks. So that'll be your exam. And then we'll move on to the fun part. So I'm sort of pushing it. I've never taught this course in 8 weeks, so it's moving fast. So you need to work some problems. All right. Well, okay, so let's say you've translated an argument into from ordinary language into standard form. You've put it into abbreviated symbolic form. And now you want to see if it breaks any rules. Let's say you do the Venn diagram technique and you find that it's invalid. So you can see that, how is it invalid? Well, I've translated I've diagrammed the major premise, I diagrammed the minor premise, I look to the conclusion, and the conclusion's not diagrammed. That means it's invalid. Okay. I know I've said that many times, but that's the key. Without that, nothing makes sense. You diagram the major and minor premise. If the conclusion is already diagrammed after having done that, it's valid. If it's not, it's invalid. But you got to know how to do that, right? And the only way to know how to do that is work problems. And if you go, the ones with the stars, I told you, the asterisks. If you go to the back of the book, the answers are there. So you can check yourself. Do it first and then check to see if you got it right. And then if you didn't get it right, figure out where you went wrong. But then work some other problems too. And and keep checking it, even though the answers aren't there. All right, so there are 6 rules. You just have to memorize these. Well, you don't have to memorize them because everything, normally if I teach this class, I have people memorize the rules. Eventually, if you want to master this material, you should memorize the rules. But you won't have to do that for this class because it's all open book. So, but you still have to understand it. So I still feel it's legitimate, but it's a lot easier if you have your book right there. But okay, so there's 6 rules. Okay, number 1 is easy. There has to be only 3 terms. Okay, so there has to be a subject term, predicate term, and a middle term. If there are more than 3 terms, then it's invalid. And the fallacy is called 4 terms. But it may be, I would say, more than 3. It doesn't have to be 4, it can be 5. Anything more than 3 is invalid. So too many terms, Copy calls it 4 terms, but it can be more than 4. Let's call it too many terms or something like that. It's okay, either way is fine. Now, that gets a little tricky because when we go to chapter 7 and we learn how to translate from ordinary language to standard form, there are going to be a whole bunch of terms. But you have to think and look for synonyms. If you say poor people, and then in another passage you say people who make less than $20,000 a year, then those 2 things mean the same thing. Because if you make less than $20,000 a year and you have a family to support, then you're in the poverty level. I think. I don't know what it is. I don't know how anyone could live nowadays on $20,000 with a family, but there's a number. But my point is, you look for synonyms. But you won't have to do that for this test. But so when you're going from ordinary language and translating into standard form, there may be a whole bunch of terms. If you can boil it down to just 3, then you only have 3 terms, and it's cool. So that's one of the methods. You look for uniform translation. So you'd have to know about synonyms. We have to know how certain expressions mean the same thing. They may be slightly different, but ultimately it means the same thing. If you say of the male gender, and if you say man, those 2 things mean the same thing. Of the female gender, or girls versus boys, so you have to know that. I mean, this is just basic, and it gets more sophisticated too, depending on how subtle and sophisticated the concepts are. But that's why, it has, but I don't mean to make it sound more complicated than it is. If there are more than 3 terms, then it's invalid. Okay, that's all you got to know for the test. But I'm just bringing this up, to this other problem. It's not a problem. It's just when you go from ordinary language standard form, there's a whole bunch of terms. So you got to try to boil it down to 3 by looking for synonyms. And if you can do that, then it's cool. It didn't break the rule. You got 3 terms, even though it's expressed in different synonymous ways. Okay, so that's an easy one. Number 1 is easy. You gotta have 3 terms. If you have more than 3 terms, then just call it more than 3 terms. Let's call it that. I like that better because it's more precise. Copy's the Mr. Precision, though. He's the logician, not me. But he calls it 4 terms, but it could be more. So, all right, that's an easy one. Now, the next 3 presuppose knowledge of distribution. That's why I wanted you to really, remember I made that little chart. What you have to know about distribution. Remember, there are A, E, I, and O propositions. If the first term, okay, so A says all S is P, or it could say all M is P, or it can say all, it doesn't matter if it's S, M, or P. What matters are the 2 places. Either all blank is blank. It could be a P, an S, or an M. That doesn't matter. What matters is the place. So with an A proposition, the first place, after, if it's all S is P or all blank is blank, the first blank is distributed in an A proposition. Okay, If you say no S is P or no blank is blank, it doesn't have to be S or P. It can be no, that first position is in that second position. It's either going to be an S, a P, or an M. With an E proposition, both the first and second positions are distributed, whether it's a P, an M, or an S. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm getting it confused now. With an E proposition, yeah, I was right. With an E proposition, the subject and predicate term, or whether it's M or P or S, the first and second positions are both distributed. When you go to an I proposition, neither one is distributed, neither the first position nor the second position. There's a little chart I made, remember, and the one with the squares around it are distributed, the ones without the squares are not. And then with an O proposition, only the second place. If it some S is not P, let's say it says that, so the S is not distributed, but the P is. So you need to know about distribution. Go back and study about distribution. There's a little chart. Because you won't be able to understand the rules if you don't know about distribution, because 3 of them have to do with distribution. So let's see if I can find the page right away on distribution. I can't find it right offhand. But you can find it. Distribution. Well, there's no rule, there's no reason to, I can't find it right off the hand, but it's a little chart. Let me make a chart right now for you again. This is important. Because, let me make it again for you. I'm sorry. Let's see. If you just memorize this little chart, see this chart? I don't know if you can see. There's A, E, I, and O, okay? And then there's 2 places. A says all something is something. E says no something is something. Now, those lines are either going to be a S, a P, or an M. And then I says some blank is blank. That's going to be an S, a P, or an M. That's going to be an S, a P, or an M. And then the O says some blank is not blank. And those blanks are going to be S, P's, or M's. So you just have to remember that with an A proposition, only that first blank, only that position, whether it's an S, a P, or an M, only that's distributed, okay? With an E proposition, they're both distributed. You have to remember that. So what I do, I make a square around the ones, I just memorize this. I memorize this in my mind, that little pattern. And then it explains everything. We call those mnemonic devices. They're memory aids. I learned how to do that in school. I was in college so long, I learned little ways to, to study. And if you can make mnemonic devices, it helps. So you just have to remember with an A proposition, that first position there, whether it's an S, a P, or an M, that's distributed, and that one's not distributed. With an E, they're both distributed. With an I, neither one is distributed. And with an O, only that space, whether it's an S, P, or an M. Okay? If you memorize that, then you'll know about distribution. Okay? Otherwise, you're going to be looking it up, like I was just doing, trying to find out, and then trying to figure out the rules, and you're just, but if you can put that in your memory, then it frees you to do the logical manipulation. It frees your mind from digging. It's hard to do many things at once, right? So try to memorize. It's not hard to memorize that. It's just a pattern. Look, those 2 are opposites, right? Those 2 are opposites. So that's not hard to memorize that. Okay, so that's distribution. And then you should know what distribution means. It means whether or not a class is completely contained in another class or not. All right. So let's go back to the rules now. Okay, in a standard form categorical proposition, the major minor premise, the major premise is going to have a middle term, either in that first position or the second position. And the middle term is going to be also in the minor premise too. The middle term never appears in the conclusion. Well, the middle term has to be distributed at least once. So you just look to see in the major premise, if it's an A proposition, is it distributed or not? Well, we just got through saying in an A proposition, the first position is, the second position is not. So wherever that middle term is, that middle term has to be distributed at least once. So it's going to appear in the major premise, it's going to appear in the minor premise. If it doesn't appear in if it's not distributed in the major premise, it has to be distributed in the minor premise. If you look in the major premise and then look to the middle term and it's not distributed, then you look to the minor premise and it's not distributed, then it didn't distribute in the major nor in the minor premise. Then it commits that fallacy. And that fallacy is called undistributed middle. That's a good name for it because the middle term is not distributed. So that's one of the qualities of a valid syllogism, that the middle term has to be distributed at least once in the premises. If it's not, it commits that fallacy of undistributed middle, okay? All right. The next one, this is the most complicated one, but it's not that hard. You just look to the conclusion. Whatever term is distributed in the conclusion, that same term has to be distributed in the premises. Now, the conclusion only contains the subject and predicate term. So then the predicate term is going to always be in the major premise. The predicate term is always in the major premise. Subject term is in the minor premise. So if the predicate term is distributed in the conclusion, it has to be distributed in the premise too. If it's not, it commits the fallacy of what's it called? Illicit major, because the predicate term of the conclusion is the major term. That's why the proposition that it contains becomes the major premise, the first premise. So if you look to the conclusion and the predicate term is distributed, and then you look to that same term and look to the major premise, and it's not distributed, then that's called illicit major, okay? If you look to the conclusion and the subject term is distributed, let's say it's an E proposition where both are distributed, and then you look to that same subject term in the minor premise and it's undistributed, then that's called illicit minor, because the minor term of the conclusion is the subject term of your conclusion is the minor term. That's why it's going to appear in the minor premise, the second premise, okay? So you just have to look to the conclusion to see if it's an I proposition, you don't have to worry because it's not distributed in either one. So you don't have to worry about it being distributed in the premises. But if it's an A, an E, or an O, then you have to look to the predicate term. If it's distributed in the conclusion, it has to be distributed in the premise. If it's not, it's called illicit major. Then you look to the minor term of the conclusion, the subject term of the conclusion, which is your minor term. If it's distributed, it has to be distributed in the minor premise. If it's not, it's called illicit minor, okay? So you don't have to, if the syllogism is valid, then you don't have to worry about any of these rules. You move on to the next syllogism. But if it's invalid, you're going to have to figure out which rule it breaks, okay? It's sort of, all right, so let's move on. Okay, a valid syllogism can have two negative premises. It's sort of related to one of the informal fallacies we were studying, the argument from ignorance. But let's not complicate things. If you have two negative premises, then it's invalid. Because you can't argue anything from two negations. Okay, so if it's okay if one premise is negative. Now, what is negative? E propositions are negative. No S is P or no S is M or whatever. Okay. And O propositions are negative. There's only two qualities, negative and affirmative. So negative ones are E and O. So if you have two E's or two O's or an E and an O, then it's invalid. You can't have two negative premises. So, and the fallacy, the formal fallacy is called exclusive premises. Because negative things exclude things, and then when you make a claim, you're asserting something. Okay, so if there's two negative premises, then it's invalid, and the fallacy is called exclusive premises. Here's another quality of a valid syllogism. If either of the premises are negative, then the conclusion has to be negative. Okay? So the major premise can be negative, and if the major and minor premises are both negative, the conclusion has to be negative. If there's any negative premise, if either one of the premises are negative, it's invalid. Okay? No, wait, I'm sorry, take that back, erase that. It's not invalid if there's two. It just means that if either of the premises are negative, the conclusion has to be negative. It doesn't mean it's invalid. I'm sorry, erase that. I made a mistake. So you have these two premises, a major and minor premise. If either one of them is negative, the conclusion has to be negative. So if they're both negative, the conclusion is negative. If the major premise is negative, it has to be negative. Minor premise is negative, it has to be negative. If either one is negative, okay, it has to be negative. So the fallacy if one of the premises are negative and the conclusion is affirmative, then what are the affirmative ones? A and I. There's only two qualities. Affirmative and negative, right? A's are affirmative, I's are affirmative, E's are negative, O's are negative. Okay, so if either one of the premises or both are negative, then the conclusion has to be negative. If the conclusion is affirmative and either one of the premises are negative, then it's invalid. And that's called drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. You just to simplify it, you can't draw an affirmative conclusion from a syllogism that contains a negative premise, either one, whether it's the subject or the major premise or the minor premise. And the last one is called no particular conclusion may be drawn from two universal premises. And that commits the existential fallacy. Remember earlier I told you that only A and E propositions, only I and O propositions contain existential import. That's why we make an X when we diagram them. There exists at least one S such that S is P, or there exists at least one M such that M is P. That X represents existential import. That means I'm positing the existence of entities. With A and E propositions, they don't contain existential import. So if you have two universal premises, so it could be two E's or two A's or an E and an A. If you have two universal, you can't conclude anything particular. So an I or an O can't be the conclusion of two A's or two E's or an A and an E. Okay, so that commits the existential fallacy. It means you're drawing a particular conclusion from two universal premises. And the reason is, with universal premises, you're not positing the existence of anything. So then if you have two universal premises and then you conclude something particular, you're committing a fallacy, an existential fallacy. And it has nothing to do with existentialism like the philosophical school, but it has to do with positing the existence of entities where you have no legitimate reason to posit them. So those are the 6 rules. Normally I have people memorize them, but you'll have them, the summary of those are on page 209. If you do the reading, I mean, sometimes Kofi is a little bit long-winded, you know, but that's, he wants to explain it. And so he explains these rules from page 205, and then he summarizes it on 209. Then he's got this flow chart. You can look at it if you want, but it makes it more complicated than it is. And sometimes you have to, sometimes I back away when somebody makes things more complicated. If I think I got it, and then somebody's explaining in a long-winded way, sometimes it's confusing. So don't worry about the flow chart. But do some examples on page 272. Trying to find the fallacy that these syllogisms commit. So I hope that was helpful. Here, you want to look at this one more time? I don't know if this helps. Remember that, that's distribution. The ones with the squares on them are distributed. Remember, it could be an S, a P, or an M in there. It's not the letter, it's the space. So with the A, only that first space is just, the ones with the squares are distributed. You got to know that for rules 2, 3, and 4. All right, we've got one more step to do, and then we get to move into the creative part of the course, which is more fun. But this is critical thinking, and it's good. The way this works, I mean, hardly anyone actually, I've never even known anyone who does this, you know, does what? Listen to someone's speech or read something and then translate it into standard form. Maybe some logicians do this, I don't know. And then test the validity of the syllogism. I mean, we do it in logic class, but I don't know how many people do this in real life. But that doesn't mean it's not a worthwhile activity, because what happens is you start developing your critical skills. It's a very, and so it's sort of like the only thing I can associate it with is like in sports. At first, like I do dog agility, and there's different crosses we do because the dog, depending on the lead leg of the dog, depending on which way the course is moving, the dog has to be on one side or the other, depending on the lead leg of the dog. So that if the course changes to a different direction, the dog has to get on the other side of you. But you have to do that in a flowing way. So there are these different crosses that you do. Well, there's one called a front cross where you turn into the dog, and as he's coming, then he's on your other side. You cross in front of him. You have to be in front of your dog to do that. And when you have a fast dog, it's hard. Okay, so at first, you work on the steps, like there's step 1, 2, 3, 4, and you do it without your dog there, and you get it down, and you work at it. And then, but in a trial, you don't think, okay, I'm taking step 1, I'm taking step 2, now I'm going to turn, now he's going to be there, make sure I make eye contact at this point. See, those are all steps you do when you're learning the process. But after a while, then it just becomes second nature. You can't think about it. There's no time to think about it. Same thing in music. If you're playing, if you're improvising, you're thinking, I'm going to do a pentatonic scale over this minor 7th flat 5 chord. There's no way. The chord, it's over. It's a nanosecond that it's moving. You can't do it. But at first, you have to learn how to do that and go very slowly at first. Same thing with this. If you work these critical skills, and you go very slowly like this, you learn how to translate from ordinary language, put it in standard form. Then what happens is you're listening to someone talk, and boom, you hear, okay, this person just made a fallacy. They made the existential fallacy. They made 2 universal claims, an A and an E proposition, and then they can claim something, some I or O proposition from that. That's a fallacy. So whatever they say is invalid. That argument is weak, because it's invalid. And that just happened. You just hear it and you see that's what happened. You just see it. And it happens fast. But at first you'd have to take, so even though I don't see actually people, you know, translating from ordinary language, going through this laborious process, what's happening is you're developing your critical skills. It's like you're working those muscles and you're getting better at it. And then your critical skills get better. So then you go through life, somebody gives a fallacious argument and you just see it and you're not duped. You're not like in a similar way as the informal fallacies. You guys did a really good job on that. I was really impressed. So this is more formal. It's almost like mathematics. You know, these are called formal fallacies. All right, so work on that. And next time I'll go over and try to, and read about the 15 valid syllogisms. There's only 15 that are valid. And these are going to be very important because we're going to learn how to use those as tools to actually construct arguments. We're going to move in the opposite direction. Instead of going from content to form, as we're doing now, we're going to go from form to content. We're going to reverse that process. That's the innovative part of this course that I feel good about. So the more you can master these skills, the more you'll be able to use those as techniques for constructing arguments. So we need to do one more thing before the exam, and that's chapter 7. And chapter 7 is just going to give you some methods to learn how to translate from ordinary language to standard form. And I want you to work on that because we're going to reverse that process. Instead of going from ordinary language to standard form, we're going to go to standard form to ordinary language. And you can reverse those methods that you learn in chapter 7. But we'll work on that next time. Okay, so do the problems. If you have any questions, you can email me. I'll respond. Work the ones with the stars and then look in the back of the book, the answer is there. All right.